The Miser and His Gold. Chapter 1. The Miser's Obsession. Once upon a time, in a quiet village tucked away in a valley surrounded by tall trees, there lived a man named Mr. Grumble. Now, Mr. Grumble was not known for his friendliness or his generosity. In fact, the villagers called him the Miser because of his great love for gold. The man's house, small and weathered with age, was situated at the edge of the village. It was a gloomy place, filled with dark corners and creaky floorboards, but none of that mattered to Mr. Grumble. What mattered most was his collection of gold coins. Each day, Mr. Grumble would wake up before the sun even thought about rising. He would carefully open his wooden chest, which had a rusty lock, and inside it, a large pile of gold coins glittered in the dim light. He counted them over and over again, running his hands through them as though they were the most precious things in the world. To him they were. No matter what anyone else needed, whether it was food, warmth, or a friendly conversation, Mr. Grumble's only joy came from his treasure. He would never share his gold, not even with the poorest villager, no matter how hungry or cold they were. If anyone asked him for help, he would only scowl and turn them away. "Why should I part with my hard-earned gold for you?" he would say. "Keep away from my riches." The villagers, while kind-hearted and helpful to each other, all knew better than to approach Mr. Grumble with any request. They learned to rely on each other instead. But every time someone spoke of Mr. Grumble's gold, they would shake their heads sadly. They couldn't understand why a man with so much wealth could be so lonely, so unkind. Chapter 2. A Visitor Comes to Town. One autumn morning, the village was visited by a stranger. He was a tall man, dressed in ragged clothes and with a tired expression on his face. His shoes were worn, and he had been walking for days. The villagers noticed him immediately as he made his way down the cobblestone streets, asking for food and shelter. "Who's that man?" a young boy named Henry whispered to his mother. "He looks very poor." "He must be a traveler," his mother replied. "We should offer him what we can." But when the stranger knocked on the door of Mr. Grumble's house, hoping for some food or a place to rest, the miser answered coldly. "What do you want?" he asked. "I've been traveling for days, sir," the stranger explained. "Could you spare a meal or a bed for the night?" Mr. Grumble's face twisted in disdain. "I have nothing for you. You should have planned better before you left your home. Now go away." The stranger, though disappointed, left Mr. Grumble's doorstep without a word. But he was not the only one in need of help. The villagers, who had overheard the exchange, quickly came together. They offered the stranger food, water, and a place to sleep for the night. That evening, as Mr. Grumble sat in his dark home, counting his gold yet again, the sound of laughter and music reached his ears from the village square. It was the villagers sharing a meal with the stranger, and their joy seemed so much more fulfilling than the cold silence of his own home. But Mr. Grumble ignored the feeling in his heart and continued to count his gold. None of them would understand. He muttered to himself, "This gold is all that I need. I don't need anyone." Chapter 3. A Strange Dream. Later that night, something unusual happened. Mr. Grumble had never been one to believe in dreams, but that night he had a dream that would change everything. In the dream, he found himself standing in a vast, empty field. All around him, piles of gold lay scattered across the ground. He knelt down, his heart racing with excitement as he reached to gather up as many coins as his arms could hold. But as he did, the gold began to turn to dust, slipping through his fingers like sand. "No!" Mr. Grumble cried out, trying desperately to hold onto the gold, but it was no use. The dust swirled away into the wind, and soon there was nothing left but an empty field. He stood there, trembling, feeling the loss deep in his heart. "What have I done?" he whispered. "What has become of my treasure?" Suddenly he heard a voice behind him. It was the traveler, standing in the shadows. "Gold is not meant to be kept," the stranger said softly. "It is meant to be shared." Mr. Grumble awoke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest. The dream left him unsettled, but he pushed the thoughts aside. "It was just a dream," he muttered, trying to calm himself. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the dream meant something more. He couldn't help but wonder if there was more to life than just his gold. Chapter 4. The Fire. The next morning, the village woke to a terrible disaster. A fire had started in the center of town, and the flames were quickly spreading. The villagers rushed to put out the fire, but it was no use. The fire was too strong. Mr. Grumble watched from the window of his house, his heart filled with fear, not for the people of the village, but for his gold. "I must save it," he cried, grabbing his coat and rushing out the door. As he ran toward the fire, he could hear the sounds of people shouting and trying to help each other. The villagers were working together, using buckets of water to try to control the flames, but it was clear that the fire was too fierce. When Mr. Grumble reached his house, he found the flames had already started to lick at the edges of the building. But the fire wasn't his greatest concern. His treasure chest, his precious gold, was inside. Ignoring everything else, Mr. Grumble broke into his house, running through the smoke-filled rooms, searching for the chest. When he finally found it, he grabbed the chest and pulled it toward the door. But just as he was about to escape, the roof above him began to collapse. The beams cracked and splintered, and the building started to fall apart. Mr. Grumble stumbled out of the house, clutching the chest with both hands. But as he stood outside, gasping for air, he realized something terrible. The fire had destroyed everything. The chest was empty. Chapter 5. The Miser's Change. Devastated, Mr. Grumble sat among the ruins of his house, surrounded by the other villagers. They were offering each other comfort, sharing what little they had left. Mr. Grumble, though, felt as though his world had ended. He had lost everything: the gold, his home, his wealth. But slowly, as he watched the kindness and generosity of the villagers, something inside him began to change. He saw how they came together, how they helped one another even though they had so little. And he realized that the gold he had clung to for so many years had never brought him true happiness. It had only isolated him, made him cold and lonely. For the first time in his life, Mr. Grumble felt a warm feeling in his heart, something that had been missing for so long. He stood up and walked over to the villagers. I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I was wrong. I've wasted my life thinking only of my gold. But I've learned something today. True happiness comes from kindness, not treasure." And from that day forward, Mr. Grumble was no longer the miserly man the villagers had known. He became a friend to everyone, always ready to help and share what little he had. His heart was as full as it had once been empty, and he discovered a new kind of wealth: the joy of giving. Then